Bialda, discovery and learning through extrapolation, uncovering hidden depths in the familiar. We navigate our daily lives under the comfortable illusion of knowledge. We believe we understand our habits, our relationships, our career choices, and the principles that guide us. We think we know why we react certain ways, what drives our decisions, and what our experiences have taught us. But genuine examination reveals something unsettling. Much of what we assume we know exists only as surface-level familiarity, thin ice over unexplored depths. Extrapolation, the practice of extending known information beyond its immediate boundaries to discover new insights, offers a powerful method for penetrating these depths. Unlike traditional learning that seeks entirely new information, extrapolation asks us to look again at what we already possess, to push at its edges, and to follow its threads into territory we've never consciously explored. When we learn to extrapolate from our existing knowledge, we don't just accumulate more facts. We fundamentally restructure our understanding and unlock dimensions of wisdom that were always present but never fully realized. Now, the illusion of complete understanding. Our brains are efficiency machines, constantly creating mental shortcuts to help us function without exhausting our cognitive resources. When we encounter familiar situations, concepts, or patterns, we quickly categorize them using past experience and move on. This serves us well in routine matters. The problem emerges when we mistake this quick categorization for comprehensive understanding. Consider how you might describe your relationship with a parent, Sadesh funding, or longtime friend. You could easily offer a summary: supportive, complicated, distant, close. You know their quirks, their likely responses, their history. You filed this relationship under a mental label and rarely question whether that label captures the full reality. But if prompted to extrapolate from specific interactions, to trace the actual patterns of communication, to examine what remains unsaid, to consider how the relationship has evolved across different contexts and life stages, you'd likely discover dimensions you'd never consciously acknowledged. This phenomenon extends across every domain of our lives. We think we know why we chose our career path, but deeper extrapolation might reveal motivations we've never admitted. We believe we understand our emotional triggers, yet careful examination of patterns might expose roots we've never traced. We assume we've learned the lessons from past failures, but systematic extrapolation of those experiences often uncovers insights we missed the first time around. The psychological concept of the illusion of explanatory depth captures this dynamic. Researchers have found that people dramatically overestimate how well they understand even common objects and processes. When asked to explain in detail how a zipper works or what steps are involved in making a cup of coffee from bean to cup, most people quickly discover gaps in knowledge they were certain they possessed. The same principle applies to self-knowledge and life experience. We operate under the assumption of understanding until the moment we attempt genuine extrapolation. The transformative benefits of extrapolation. When we commit to learning through extrapolation, we unlock several profound benefits that extend far beyond simple knowledge acquisition. Depth over breadth. In a culture obsessed with consuming more information, extrapolation offers a counterintuitive path. Instead of constantly seeking new inputs, you mine existing knowledge for deeper insights. A single significant relationship, carefully examined, can teach you more about human nature, attachment patterns, communication dynamics, and your own psychology than reading a dozen books on relationships. One professional failure, thoroughly extrapolated, yields richer lessons than 100 success podcasts. This depth creates a different quality of wisdom. When you extrapolate from lived experience, the insights emerge already integrated with your actual life circumstances. They don't need to be translated from abstract principles into personal application because they were extracted from your specific reality in the first place. Enhanced pattern recognition. Extrapolation trains your mind to identify patterns across domains. When you practice extending one insight into related territories, you develop a skill that transfers broadly. You begin noticing how the patience you've cultivated in one area might apply elsewhere, how a communication pattern in your family might mirror something in your workplace, how a problem-solving approach from a hobby might translate to a professional challenge. This cross-domain pattern recognition represents a sophisticated form of intelligence. It allows you to solve novel problems using insights derived from seemingly unrelated experiences. The person who extrapolates lessons from learning a musical instrument might discover principles that transform their approach to project management, not because the domains are similar, but because extrapolation has trained them to identify transferable underlying structures. Reduced cognitive overload. Paradoxically, going deeper into what you already know can feel more manageable than constantly consuming new information. The modern information landscape creates perpetual anxiety about what we haven't yet learned, haven't yet read, haven't yet experienced. Extrapolation shifts the focus from external acquisition to internal cultivation. When you recognize that tremendous wisdom already exists within your accumulated experience, waiting to be uncovered, the pressure to constantly consume new content diminishes. You can approach learning as archaeology rather than shopping, excavating richness from existing ground rather than always seeking new territory. Stronger memory and integration. Information you've actively extrapolated from your own experience embeds itself more deeply in memory than facts you've passively consumed. The cognitive effort of extending known information into new insight creates robust neural connections. When you work to extrapolate how a childhood experience influences your current behavior, that insight integrates at a level that reading about attachment theory never could. This integration means the knowledge becomes truly usable. It's not stored away as an interesting fact, but woven into your actual operating system, available for immediate application when relevant situations arise. Increased confidence and self-trust. Learning through extrapolation builds confidence in your own cognitive abilities. When you regularly discover that you can generate valuable insights from your existing knowledge base, you begin to trust your capacity to navigate complexity. This self-trust proves particularly valuable in ambiguous situations where external authorities offer conflicting advice. You learn that you can examine your experience, extrapolate forward, and make reasoned decisions based on your own analysis. Hey, how to practice discovery through extrapolation. Discovery through extrapolation requires deliberate practices that pull hidden insights from familiar territory. The following approaches provide concrete methods for developing this capacity. The assumption audit. Begin by identifying areas where you operate on unexamined assumptions. Pick a relationship, belief, habit, or decision that feels settled, something you rarely question. Write down what you know about it in simple, declarative statements. Then systematically challenge each statement. For example, you might write, "I'm not good at public speaking." Now extrapolate. When exactly does this manifest? Have there been exceptions? What specifically makes it difficult? Fear of judgment, lack of preparation, discomfort with attention, or something else? When you trace this belief to specific incidents, what actually happened versus what you concluded? Have your communication skills improved in other contexts? What would need to be true for this belief to be inaccurate? This audit often reveals that our settled conclusions rest on surprisingly thin evidence, usually a few salient experiences that we've unconsciously extrapolated into universal truths without examining whether that extrapolation was warranted. We'll look through the microscopic examination. Select a single significant experience and examine it with far greater granularity than you normally would. If you typically think about a past relationship in broad strokes, zoom in on individual conversations. What exactly was said? What did you feel in your body? What assumptions were you making about the other person's intentions? What were you trying to communicate beyond your actual words? This microscopic approach frequently reveals complexity you'd glazed over in your usual summarization. The relationship you dismissed as just didn't work out might reveal under close examination specific patterns of miscommunication that you've since repeated with others. The job you left because it wasn't a good fit might show, upon detailed analysis, that you were reacting to a particular dynamic that reflects a larger pattern in how you handle authority or conflict. The extrapolation chain. Take a specific insight or piece of knowledge and deliberately extend it through a chain of questions. Start with something you know, then ask, what does this imply? If that's true, what else might be true? Where else might this pattern appear? What would happen if I applied this principle to a different domain? For instance, you might notice that you feel most energized after spending time in nature. Rather than stopping there, extrapolate. What specifically about nature creates this effect? Is it the lack of social demands, the physical movement, the visual complexity, the absence of artificial stimulation, or something else? If you identified the key element, where else could you find it? What does this suggest about your optimal work environment? How might this inform your living space design? What does it reveal about your sensory processing? Each link in the chain takes you further from the initial observation into territory you've never consciously explored, yet each step follows logically from what came before. The parallel analysis. Identify two seemingly unrelated areas of your life and look for structural similarities. How is your approach to romantic relationships similar to or different from your approach to career challenges? What parallels exist between how you handle financial decisions and how you handle health decisions? Does your hobby reveal anything about how you tackle work projects? This practice trains your mind to identify transferable patterns. You might discover that the patience and systematic approach you bring to gardening is entirely absent from how you try to build new skills at work, suggesting an opportunity to extrapolate successful strategies from one domain to another. Or you might notice that the risk tolerance you demonstrate in one area contradicts the caution you exercise elsewhere, pointing to unexamined beliefs that influence different life domains differently. The historical trace. Take a current characteristic, belief, or behavior and trace its development backward through your life. Don't just identify a single origin point, but map the evolution. How has this pattern manifested at different ages? What reinforced it? What challenged it? What slight variations have appeared in different contexts? This historical extrapolation often reveals that what you thought was a fixed personality trait is actually a learned response that has shifted over time, suggesting it remains open to further evolution. It can also uncover formative experiences you'd forgotten that still shape current patterns. How to practice learning through extrapolation. While discovery focuses on uncovering hidden knowledge in what you already know, learning through extrapolation involves using existing knowledge as a foundation for acquiring new understanding more efficiently and meaningfully. The connection web. Whenever you encounter new information, immediately work to connect it to existing knowledge through multiple pathways. If you learn a new psychological concept, don't just memorize the definition. Ask, what does this explain about my own behavior? Where have I seen this in others? How does this connect to other concepts I know? What predictions does this concept allow me to make? How might this be wrong or incomplete? This practice transforms isolated facts into integrated understanding. The new information becomes a node in your existing knowledge network rather than a disconnected data point you'll likely forget. The application exercise. When you learn something new, immediately identify 3 specific ways you could apply it to your current life circumstances. This forced extrapolation from abstract principle to concrete application accomplishes 2 things. It tests whether you actually understand the concept well enough to use it, and it begins the integration process that makes knowledge usable rather than merely possessed. If you can't generate genuine applications, you probably don't understand the concept as well as you think. The inability to extrapolate from principle to practice signals a gap in understanding that passive review won't reveal. The teaching translation. Attempt to explain new concepts to yourself as if teaching someone else who knows nothing about the subject. This requires extrapolating from the terminology and context in which you encounter the information to a more fundamental level of understanding. You can't rely on jargon or assume background knowledge, forcing you to identify the core principles in their relationships. This practice frequently exposes areas where your understanding remains superficial. If you can't explain it simply, you need to extrapolate further from what you know to what you don't yet fully grasp. The boundary testing. When learning something new, deliberately test its boundaries by asking where it doesn't apply. What are the exceptions? What conditions are required for this to be true? What happens in edge cases? This extrapolation toward limitations prevents overgeneralization and creates a more nuanced, accurate understanding. For example, if you learn that regular exercise improves mood, extrapolate to boundaries. At what point does exercise become counterproductive? For whom might this not apply? Under what circumstances might exercise worsen mood? What mechanisms explain the effect? This boundary testing transforms a simple fact into dimensional understanding. The scenario projection. Use new knowledge to make predictions about situations you haven't yet encountered. If you've learned something about group dynamics, extrapolate forward. How might this play out in your next team meeting? What would you expect to observe if this principle is accurate? What would surprise you? This projection serves two purposes. First, it tests the robustness of your understanding. Second, it creates specific predictions you can evaluate against reality, giving you immediate feedback on whether you've accurately extrapolated from the new information. Practical applications across life domains. The power of learning through extrapolation becomes most apparent when applied consistently across different areas of life. In relationships. Rather than seeking endless advice about relationships, extrapolate deeply from your actual relationship history. What patterns appear across different relationships? What consistently works for you versus what theory suggests should work? How do your successful friendships differ from your difficult ones? What does your communication style in various relationships reveal about your underlying needs and fears? One deeply examined relationship teaches more than dozens of superficially processed ones. When you extrapolate from specific interactions to general patterns, from particular conflicts to underlying dynamics, you develop relationship intelligence that generic advice can never provide. In career development, instead of constantly seeking new skills to add to your resume, extrapolate from your existing strengths. What do you do easily that others find difficult? What patterns of success appear across different projects? What conditions allow you to produce your best work? How do your energy patterns throughout the day or week influence your productivity? This self-extrapolation often reveals capabilities you've undervalued because they come naturally to you. It can also expose mismatches between your actual working style and your job structure, suggesting modifications that would dramatically improve your effectiveness without requiring you to become someone different. In personal growth, rather than adopting a new self-improvement program every few months, extrapolate from your history of change. When have you successfully modified behavior? What made those efforts work when others failed? What time of year or life circumstances support your growth? How do you personally integrate new habits? This historical extrapolation allows you to design change strategies that work with your actual psychology rather than fighting it. You stop trying to force yourself into someone else's system and instead craft approaches extrapolated from your demonstrated patterns of successful change. In decision-making, when facing a significant decision, extrapolate from your decision history. What did you prioritize in past decisions? How did those decisions actually work out compared to your predictions? What did you learn from decisions you later regretted? What do your best decisions have in common? This extrapolation builds decision-making wisdom that generic frameworks can't provide because it's calibrated to your specific values, your particular blind spots, and your demonstrated patterns of reasoning. Overcoming obstacles to effective extrapolation. Several predictable obstacles interfere with learning through extrapolation, but awareness of these barriers allows you to navigate around them. Premature closure. The mind seeks resolution. When you begin examining something familiar, your brain wants to quickly arrive at a conclusion and move on. Effective extrapolation requires resisting this pressure, staying with ambiguity longer than feels comfortable, continuing to ask questions even after an initial answer emerges. Practice noticing when you feel the impulse to declare something figured out, then deliberately push past that point to see what additional insights remain. 1. Confirmation bias. When extrapolating from existing knowledge, you risk simply confirming what you already believe rather than discovering new dimensions. Combat this by actively seeking disconfirming evidence. Ask, what would prove this conclusion wrong? What have I ignored that doesn't fit this pattern? What alternative interpretations exist? The goal isn't to doubt everything, but to ensure your extrapolations follow the evidence rather than your preferences. Insufficient detail. Valuable extrapolation requires specific, detailed examination. Vague generalizations produce vague extrapolations. If you think about a relationship in terms like, it was complicated, or a work situation as stressful, you have insufficient detail to extrapolate meaningful insights. Force yourself to identify specific examples, particular conversations, exact feelings, and concrete behaviors. Rich extrapolation grows from rich observation. Emotional avoidance. Sometimes we avoid genuine extrapolation because it threatens to reveal something we'd rather not acknowledge about ourselves, our relationships, or our choices. We maintain our comfortable illusions by refusing to look closely enough for them to crumble. Recognize that the discomfort of facing these truths is almost always less painful than the ongoing cost of living with unexamined patterns that don't serve you. The insights that feel most uncomfortable to extract are often the most valuable. Building a practice of extrapolation. Making extrapolation a consistent practice rather than an occasional exercise requires building supporting structures. Regular reflection time. Schedule dedicated time for examination without a specific problem to solve. This open-ended reflection provides space for extrapolation without the pressure of immediate application. A weekly review of significant interactions, decisions, and observations creates raw material for deeper analysis. Question lists. Develop a personal set of extrapolation questions you return to regularly. What pattern am I noticing? Where else does this appear? What's beneath this? What does this reveal about my assumptions? What am I not seeing? These questions become tools you can apply across different domains. External perspective. While extrapolation is fundamentally an internal practice, trusted others can help you see what you miss. A good conversation partner asks questions that prompt deeper extrapolation, points out patterns you've overlooked, and challenges conclusions you've reached too quickly. Written exploration. Writing forces more rigorous extrapolation than simply thinking. The act of putting observations and questions into words reveals gaps in your reasoning and prompts deeper examination. Keep an ongoing journal specifically for extrapolation exercises, returning to previous entries to trace how your understanding evolves. Conclusion. We live in an age of information abundance but wisdom scarcity. We accumulate experiences, relationships, successes, and failures at a remarkable rate, yet we rarely extract their full value. We move from one thing to the next, always consuming, rarely digesting. Learning through extrapolation offers an antidote. It suggests that we already possess most of what we need to understand ourselves and navigate our lives more skillfully. The wisdom isn't missing. We simply haven't looked closely enough to find it. When you develop the capacity to examine what you already know with genuine curiosity, when you learn to extend insights beyond their obvious boundaries, when you practice tracing patterns across domains and through time, you transform your relationship with knowledge. You move from being a passive consumer of information to an active generator of wisdom. The familiar becomes mysterious again, not because you know less, but because you recognize how much more there is to know. The experiences you thought you'd already understood reveal new dimensions. The relationships you'd mentally filed away open up. The decisions you'd summarized expand into rich case studies of your own psychology. You discover that you have been walking past treasure, mistaking it for ordinary ground because you'd stopped looking carefully. Extrapolation is the practice of looking again, looking closer, looking longer, and finding that the territory you thought you knew contains worlds you have never explored. In developing this practice, you cultivate not just knowledge, but a way of being with knowledge. You become someone who trusts that insight can be found not just out there in the next book, course, or expert, but right here in the accumulated wisdom of your lived experience, waiting to be uncovered through patient, curious, rigorous examination. The question isn't whether you have enough information. You almost certainly do. The question is whether you're willing to look closely enough at what you already possess to discover what it actually contains.